I'm just going to say a quick few hellos, and then we'll get going. I'm Tom O'Leary. I'm chairing the event today. I'm Head of Public Engagement and Learning at the Houses of Parliament, and I also curate their annual TEDx event, which is how I've actually got to meet James. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today to RSA's special event. Before we begin, could I remind you that this is live, you're being filmed, and so could you make sure your mobile phones are turned off, or very much at least on silent if you're wishing to tweet. We're live streaming, we're on YouTube, so welcome to our viewers online. And a reminder that we have a hashtag which is RSA Stuffication, so if you want to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. So housekeeping over, I'm now able to introduce our speaker, James Wallman. James is a journalist, author and trend forecaster. He has commented on trends happening now and predicted what will happen next for a wide range of publications, including GQ, New York Times, the Financial Times, and also for clients such as BMW, Burberry and Nike. James joins us today to share some of his insights from his new book, Stuffication, which is a perfectly timed corrective to the annual pre-Christmas shopping frenzy, and we will be following you after this to see what you do. In his book and in his talk today, James explains why more and more of us are suffering from stuffication, where instead of feeling enriched by the things we own, we are stifled and overwhelmed by them. So what is the cure for this particular modern affliction? Let's find out, so please join me in welcoming James Wolman.
Thank you, Tom. The best place to begin the story of stuffication is the place that many great stories begin. It's in wartime with a young couple who are in love. On the 27th of January, 1940, it was a quiet night in London. It was snowing in the north of the city, quite heavily. And outside of a dance hall, busy, bustling dance hall, a young man called Jack stepped outside wearing a dicky bow and bringing with him his new bride, Pam, by the hand. And he said to her, "Come on, let's go home." And they tramped through snow to their first home. They had two rooms. They had a bedroom and they had a living room. They shared the bathroom and the kitchen with the other people that lived in the building. And a few years later, they had a son called Alan. And when Alan grew too big, they gave him the bedroom. So every night, after they'd put Alan to bed, they would make up a camp bed in the living room and sleep on that. And every morning, before Alan left for his paper round, he would wake to the smell of bacon and sausages and eggs, and something that some of you may remember called fried bread. Now, Jack cooked that every morning for Alan, every morning until the day he left for university in 1962. Now, Alan went to Liverpool University. He was the first in his family ever to go. His auntie Lulu had been offered a place in Oxford in the 30s, but the family couldn't afford to send her. And he made the most of it. He was in the university football team. He saw bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones before they were famous. And after university, he settled down, he got a job, he got married, he had children. I'm one of those children. Alan is my father. Jack and Pam are my grandparents. Why am I telling you this? Because in the story of our very ordinary, very normal, typical British family in the 20th century, you can see the story of stuffication, in the change in circumstances from scarcity to abundance. And I think there you can see the change in circumstances, attitudes, behaviours and values of the rest of Western society as well. You see, my grandparents were typical. They lived not so far from survival mode, as most people did then, and as 99% of people had always done. And my father was a typical baby boomer materialist. He measured his life in many ways through the material things he had, like the cars he drove. And I remember many of them. In the 1970s, there was a boxy blue Triumph Toledo, and then a curvy, caramel-coloured Cavalier Mark I. And then in the 80s, we had the much more angular, so we thought anyway, silver Cavalier Mark II. And then something called an Opel Senator, big tank-like thing. We loved it. It had electric windows and heated seats, even in the back, I think. And then at the end of the 1980s, my father had a red Porsche 911. And the thing is, if you call somebody a materialist today, it's an insult, right? To say you're materialistic, you're so materialistic, it's an insult. But my father grew up believing in that idea. And he believed in the paradoxical idea at the heart of materialism, which had gained ground in the early part of the 20th century, that if we wanted to have more, we had to spend more. And that made a lot of sense, because that was taking him, it offered the most direct route from the scarcity that he'd been born into to the abundance that he was creating. For himself, sure, and for the rest of society around him, and for his children as well. He was creating a better world. So growing up in the 70s and the 80s, I grew up believing in that too. And I thought I would grow up to be a materialist, just like my dad. But then something happened, or rather, lots of things happened. And they've all added up to this situation that I call stuffication. Now, stuffication is the idea that instead of thinking of more the way we used to, the way people used to think that more was a good thing, we now think more means more to store, more to think about, more hassle. Instead of being a good thing, more is worse. It's a pain. Overwhelmed and suffocating from stuff, I think we're feeling stuffication. Why? Why have so many of us had enough of stuff? Why isn't materialism working anymore? Now, with anything as seismic as stuffication, if you ask a different expert, you'll get a different emphasis. So a political scientist might say to you, the reason we've had enough of stuff, we're just not so bothered about stuff, is that we've grown up in stable societies. So because we know that we're going to have a roof over our heads tonight, we know there's going to be food on the table tomorrow, we're just not so bothered anymore about basic materialistic concerns. We've climbed the first level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. A philosopher might say that we've had enough of stuff simply because of the status anxiety that comes with it, the status anxiety that comes with the snakes and ladders game of materialistic consumerism. And a psychologist would probably agree and say the reason we've had enough of stuff is it's making us unwell, it's giving us affluenza. Because the truth is that mass production and mass consumption has ultimately led to mass depression. And the statistics for that are frightening. An environmentalist would say we've had enough of stuff because we're worried about climate change, our carbon footprint, and landfill. And a technologist might say all of the above makes sense. But the real reason that we've had enough of material goods is because we can. Why have a second car or a car at all when you can have a zip car? Why load up your suitcase when you go on holiday with books when you can take a Kindle? Now, I think that the most interesting thing for me about these reasons is they're not, and if you think about it, they're not blips. They're going to be here one year and gone the next. These are observable, observed, long-term trends. I think of them more like insistent storm waves crashing again and again against our materialistic culture. That's why I believe that stuffication is the most pressing problem of our time. So, how do you solve a problem like stuffication? Now, the job of a trend forecaster, which I do, is a pretty interesting one. It gives you some unique insights, a really unique viewpoint, and it opens you up to a lot of ridicule. Because if you're going to make a prediction, you better have a decent methodology. Now, the method I use, I don't read tea leaves, and I don't breathe in vapors like the oracle at Delphi. The method I use is far less ancient, and I like to think it's a fair bit more robust. It's inspired by something a futurist called William Gibson once said, that the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And it's informed by a way of reading cultural change that's been applied more than 5,000 times since it was first codified in 1962 by a sociologist called Everett Rogers. It's called the diffusion of innovations. And it's a great way to understand how new ideas, innovations spread through any community. And it could be a new way of cooking gourmet burgers. It could be a new way of working. It could be a new way of living. And it's how those ideas spread from the innovators to the early adopters to the early majority, late majority, and laggards. The laggards are those people you know who even today only turn on their phone to make outgoing calls. So I spent a fair bit of time looking for viable, possible, and inspiring innovations that could replace materialism. And to be honest with you, I've written most of them off. They don't work for different reasons, but there is one. There's one innovative way of living that I think could be the one. It's called experientialism. And the people who are living it, I call experientialists. It's quite simple. Instead of looking for happiness, for status, and for meaning in material goods, these experientialists are finding happiness, status, and meaning in experiences instead. Experientialism, I believe, can solve a problem like stuffication. More importantly, I think experientialism will solve stuffication. Because it's better. It's better than materialism at making us happy. It's better at giving us status. And it's better at giving our lives meaning. More importantly, I've seen the signs. Even if they're still unevenly distributed, I've seen evidence that shows that we're moving away from materialism and that experientialism is making the jump from the innovators to the mainstream, to the majority. So there's evidence that shows that our attitudes are changing. So there's a guy, he's a political scientist by the name of Ron Inglehart, and he's been studying our attitudes since 1970, based on a hunch he had in '69. And he found in 1970, when he first did his research, that 80% of people were materialistic. We lived in a materialistic society. And he's been doing the research ever since, and now it's 50% of people are materialistic. So you can see there is long-term decline in how materialistic our culture is. As well as changing attitudes, there is now evidence that our behaviour is changing as well. A man lives in Oxford called Chris Goodall, who's an ex-McKinsey consultant, has studied the material flows of the flows of material around the UK. And he's found that since 2003, we have been consuming less stuff, less cars, concrete, water, and paper, for example. He says that we've passed the point of peak stuff. Really interestingly, he's seen the signs of this in other developed economies as well, like Sweden, France, and the US. And also, there's social media. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. which I think is really interesting because it's fundamentally changed how we get status. If you think about the 20th century, people got status from the things that they owned, their cars, their shoes, their handbags, not from what they did. Who knew back then that you'd been to Paris or Amsterdam for the weekend? Who knew that you'd been to the opera last night? Who knew you'd been to the Royal Society of Arts at lunchtime to hear a talk? But with all your followers on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, whatever it might be, they do. So now, if you post a picture of the sunrise over Angkor Wat, or the sun setting over the Atlas Mountains from the rooftop of your riad in Marrakesh, or you tweet a quote from something you heard at the RSA, people will know about it. So that means that in the 21st century, what we do matters that much more than what we have in terms of status. And that matters because status matters to people. And the rise of social media matters to the rise of experientialism because this isn't the few. It's not the few innovators who are tweeting and using Facebook. There are hundreds of millions of people who are using Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. There's 215 million active Twitter users. There are 1.2 billion on Facebook. So this isn't the few. This is the many who are increasingly getting their status, not from what they have, but from what they do. So what does all this mean for you? About 10 years ago, on January the 27th, 2002, my father, Alan, brought my grandparents, Jack and Pam, over for lunch at my new flat. It was my first flat in Brixton. And I had 3 bedrooms, I had this vast lounge, I had a separate dining room. And over lunch, we talked about days out on the bus. My brother and I loved to go on double-decker buses when we were kids. And they'd take us to the Toy Museum in Bethnal Green. And we talked about, or maybe I talked about my big shot career in advertising that I was following at the time. And just before they left, my grandfather gave me an envelope. And in it was a £5 note, which was about enough for 2 beers back then, and a note that he'd written. And it said on it, 27/1/2002. This date in 1940, Nana and I tramped through snow to our first home. Memories live longer than dreams. Treat yourself to a nice memento. Good luck. Now, as my father was driving my grandparents home, and in case you're interested in the car, it was a black 5 Series BMW. My grandfather choked, my father told me later. My grandfather choked and he collapsed in his seat. And my father, he jumped the lights, he raced through traffic, he got pulled over by a police car and he then got an escort from the police to the nearest hospital. And he did what he could. But my grandfather died that day. And as you can imagine, I've thought about that note he gave me quite a lot since then. Did he know somehow that he was going to die that day? And what did he mean by memories live longer than dreams? Did he mean simply that the past matters more than the future? Or did he mean, and this is what I've come to believe, that material dreams have their place, but that memories matter much more, and those are memories that come from experiences? He may have meant that. He may not have meant that. But whatever he meant, I think it was quite a passing shot. In his final moments to address the most important question we can ask, the question that Aristotle asked in the Nicomachean Ethics almost 2,500 years ago. The question that all of us as individuals, as parents, as policymakers, and as influential people should ask: how should we live in order to be happy? In the 20th century, the answer to that question was simple. When the problem was scarcity, the answer was, you should be a materialist. Now, in the 21st century, when our problem isn't scarcity, our problem is abundance, our problem is having too much stuff, this problem of stuffication, the answer has fundamentally changed. The story of stuffication ends, I think, where many great stories end, with you. What are you going to do about the most pressing problem of our time? I think there are 3 things you can do, starting today. And the first is de-stuffocate. Get rid of all that stuff that you don't need. You can start small. You can pick a room or a drawer or a cupboard. Or you can go big and go through your house like a mad person, throwing everything that you haven't worn or used in recent memory into bin bags. Tie them up, put them out of sight, and leave them there for a month. Now, if you miss something, you can go get it, but then close the bags back up again. Because at the end of that month, all the things that are in those bags that you didn't miss, you don't need. So get rid of them. Step 2, don't re-stuffocate. It's so easy. You know, when you clear some space in a cupboard or on the shelves in your lounge to think, what are we going to put there? We've been trained to do that. Resist the urge to do that, even if it's 70% off. Step 3. And to me, step 3 is the best bit because it's a game. It makes step 1 worthwhile and it makes step 2 easier. And it's a game that I think of as the Brewster's Millions game. It's inspired by the 1902 novel and the 1980s movie, where Brewster has to spend $1 million in a month and have nothing physical, tangible to show for it. Now, to play the game properly, you don't have to spend $1 million. But you do have to spend the same amount of money you would normally have spent. If you do that, you'll have more stories, more status, you'll feel happier, and you'll really feel like life has more meaning. And more than that, more than just having fun, you'll be one of the innovators. You'll be doing your part to take our society on the sharpest, most direct route out of the storm of stuffication. You'll be taking us from the old age of materialism to the new era of experientialism. And what's more, I think you'll understand what my grandfather, Jack, meant, that memories live longer than dreams.
Thank you, James. I'm just going to have the privilege of questioning James first, just for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're going to come out to the audience and ask you for any questions that you might have for James. Knowing that I was chairing today, obviously one of the things I've done is read James's book. And I think it's a very interesting book because it challenges you in terms of how you are living and things you're doing, and it raises lots of questions, and I have some of those questions for James. But the first obvious one I'm going to ask him is, what's he giving everybody for Christmas?
Do I need to answer that? So, for those of you from my family that are watching, if you have a Kindle, you're going to get the file, and if not, you'll receive the book. What better gift could somebody give somebody?
Reading...
Can I just say that
Of course.
I didn't ask him to ask that question.
Someone else told me to ask that one. Reading your book, one of the things that you commented on was in terms of where society/economies are in terms of the trajectory which you're forecasting, and that a number of countries are clearly not at where the consumerist societies are, particularly in the West, such as our economy and society. So what's going to happen to those countries that are acquiring consumerism, acquiring capitalist states at great speed? Are they going to go through the same process that you're seeing and forecasting, or is it going to be different for them?
It will certainly be different. It's very rare to see one model shift to another, but at the same time, I believe that they are on similar development curves, but just much faster. If you think about our Industrial Revolution, which took 150, 200 years, you think about all the blind alleys that we ran up and the mistakes we made along that way. Those other economies can learn from us really quickly. And so in the same way that their industrial revolutions are much quicker, and their consumer revolutions, if you think about it, are incredibly quick. We did some research a year or two back that looked at people in China. And that story I told there about my grandfather to my father to me, this guy in China had made that journey in his own lifetime. The speed of change was incredible. So I think that they will have their own version of stuffication. If you think about China today, the issues that they have with the environment, for example, or some of the protests about happiness. Happiness in China has remained pretty similar. Richard Easterlin has researched this over the past 20 years, while income has quadrupled on average. So there's question marks already about, is GDP so great over there?
Okay, thank you. That's really, really interesting. But do you think some countries will never get to a point where stuffication is actually an issue?
Because, good question. Bhutan, perhaps, where they're already made, in Bhutan specifically, they are interested in gross national happiness. It's a specific strategy of the ruling government. Countries that won't reach stuffication, the thing is about stuffication is it's a good problem to have. I think that's a really important point. Materialism, which I see as the value system which underpinned consumerism, which has underpinned capitalism and the great success that we have, took us from scarcity to abundance. It's the reason why we all have so many things and such great lives today, I believe. So any country that doesn't, and stuffication is just a handy word to put this into, but that problem of abundance is a good problem to have. So if a country doesn't have that problem, wow, sounds like they're missing out.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a slightly different tack now. Like many parents in the room, I'm sure that when they think of stuffication, one of the things they think of is their children, in terms of all the stuff that they accumulate. And if I fall over stuff in my house and I have to clear stuff away, it tends to be all the stuff my children leave lying around. So it's got me thinking that in terms of the behaviour, are children actually naturally with you in terms of their experientialists? And if you think of the cliche of a child opening a present, I think with a young child, where they're more interested in the box and the present, and the opening of the present is more interesting than the actual thing itself. So are young children in some ways kind of ahead of you, but then we imbue them with wanting gifts and accumulating stuff, which we then are going to have to deal with. So I'm interested in whether almost naturally we're with you, but we go through a process where you become, all the things coming at you turn you into a consumer and a capitalist, and you acquire this stuff.
I think it's such an interesting question, and the shorter answer is I don't know the answer. I'm not a child expert. I've got my own personal experience, and someone that's read the book sent me an email, and she lives in Stockholm, and she said that they asked their 11-year-old child what he wanted for Christmas, and he said he didn't want anything. He had too much stuff, which is, she wasn't sure if he's just incredibly developed or whereas my daughter, who's 2.5, she brings a book to me now and points out the books on the back, you know, how they have them, and says, Daddy, I want that, I want that, I want that, I want that. And we had a family do it at the weekend, and were given gifts to put under our Christmas tree. And the first thing she did was go and open one of them. So we've taken them away, and because we obviously believe in this idea, we don't want to fill her life with stuff. I think we do teach people to be materialistic. You think about the whole Santa thing, because we were thinking, what do we give our daughter for Christmas? We want to give her presents, right? We don't want to be mean. For her second birthday, we took her to see Iggle Piggle, a character that she likes in a play. But she should have some presents to open, because that's what we know. I don't have the answer, as you can tell. I'd love to if anyone does.
Maybe we'll come to that in a moment or two. Something else that occurred to me listening to you and reading your book is about whether the experiences that you describe are potentially for the privileged to experience, and to, watching a sunset in somewhere particularly glamorous, that's quite expensive. And scuba diving off the Barrier Reef, whatever it might be. Some of those things, I think the things that we tend to go towards as experiences might be the preserve of people who are actually quite wealthy. So, and if that then imbues them with status, you're replacing a kind of status anxiety with a different set of drivers, if that might be the case. So I wonder if you might comment on how you see people moving away from consuming right across the spectrum.
I think you've raised a couple of really interesting points, and if I can sort of pick them out. For me, one is that replacing stuff with experience in terms of status, in terms of keeping up with the Joneses or being one ahead of your neighbours is one. And the other one, I think, was your point about moving away from consumerism. And I want to be clear here that this isn't an anti-consumerist idea. It's not anti-capitalist at all. I think that the system that we live in has given us the abundance. I think there are some issues with the system, and the issue is materialism. But if we can shift that spending from material things to experiences, to experiential purchases, I think it'll be positive in lots of ways. So it's not against spending. At the same time, it's not the preserve of the privileged few. You don't have to watch the sun setting over the Atlas Mountains, or tweet a picture from Chamonix on a chairlift. If you look at the statistics, it shows that if you live near a park, you will be happier. And that's by virtue of the fact that being in a park is a nice experience to have, and it's free. If you are the kind of person that enjoys architecture but hates consumerism, you can have a great time on Oxford Street. If you look up above those shop fronts, Oxford Street's amazing. So actually, it's not just for the privileged few. Partly, I think the reason why I've used those examples is because they're vivid and they make sense. But going for a walk with a friend, which costs nothing, is a great experience, actually. But it's not anti-capitalist. That's really important. And the shift from stuff to experiences, and just using those as a new way to keep up with the Joneses and be one more than them, I don't think there's a particular solution there, partly because we're humans. So social hierarchy is part of what it means to be human. It's important where we fit into status. But if you look at the differences between experiences and material goods, experiences are better at making us happy. This was discovered in 2003 by two psychologists called Leif van Boven and Tom Gilovich. And the thing is, even if we compete with our neighbours and with our friends by doing the more exciting thing, we will still be doing something. And actually, if you look at experiences, they're much harder to compare. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, and I really like this example, if your neighbours go to the Seychelles or Mauritius, to one of those incredible 5-star honeymoon resorts for 2 weeks on holiday, and you go to Wales for 2 weeks camping, it's very clear who's had the swankier holiday, isn't it? Right? Drinking champagne, chilled champagne brought to you on a beach is much fancier than having a warm beer on a beach, on the Gower, or wherever it might be. But who's having the better time? Who's happier? Which would you rather do? It's quite a tough call, isn't it? And that's one of the really interesting things about experiences, is that they're much harder to compare than material goods. So by their very nature, they kind of mess around with that status game anyway. And you don't need to spend more money and have more to play that game.
My final question, again, that's something you raise in your book, is there's an interesting interplay between experiences, because we're kind of separating experiences and sort of consuming. Now, where companies create an amazing experience, and we know a certain phone and iPod producer that does this, where their experience provides an incredible market for their product, but I want the next one, I want the next shiny one, because there's inbuilt obsolescence. Now, maybe that inbuilt obsolescence is to do with the nature of the product being new technology, and new technology changes at such a pace. But I want to consume that product, but it's brilliant because of the experience it provides. So are there kind of crossover areas, and is that an interesting thing to consider?
Definitely crossover areas, because if you think about goods, they give us experiences. What do you do with a bicycle? You buy a bicycle to go cycling. So material goods have always given us experiences. In terms of the crossover, Tom, I don't think that in 2014, at some point after the January sales, or 2015, we're suddenly going to say, right, that's it. We've had it with material goods. I don't want the next iPad, even if the experience is better. I don't want any more material goods in my life. This is long-term cultural change. And if you think about materialism as a value system, and if you think about how long it took for materialism, which was quite very much artificially created, I believe, in the 20s and 30s, particularly in the States, and then spread from there to other countries. It took most of the 20th century to catch on. And it's really only catching on now in Brazil, India, China, Indonesia, etc. And I think it's exactly the same for experientialism. It's going to take time to go from one to the other.
Thank you. Right, it's your turn to ask James some questions. I can see hands shooting up. So what we'll do is there are microphones that will be coming round, and if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone, and if you could just say your name and ideally stand up if you can, so James can see you so he can reply. So in terms of microphones, if we could have one go to the gentleman at the back, and if we could start to bring one down here, please, the gentleman in this row. So if you would like to start. Thank you.
Hi, James. I find it interesting that you talk about the change from goods to experiences, but can you see if we'll move from experiences to competitive nature? Because I feel like the experiences just become another form of competition with your neighbour, and whether you can see a trend moving away to the desire to compete.
To the desire to do what, sorry?
The desire to compete with your neighbour.
Do I think we'll move away from that?
Yes, I feel like the experience moving from the goods is just moving to another competition.
I agree with you. No, I don't think we will. And I think, it's my job to look for alternatives. It's been my job to look for innovations that I think will catch on. And if you look at forecasts for the future, which to me don't work, they're often based on some sort of enlightened human. You know those enlightened humans we all wish we were, and we wish our neighbours were too, and I don't need to compete with my neighbour. I can be above all that. I think we're humans. So we'll still need stuff. We're flesh and blood. We're still going to need stuff, and I think we're still going to want to compete. It's just harder to compete, or it's a different way of competing in terms of experiences than it is with material goods. So if my neighbour one side has a Porsche, one side has a Audi, and I have a really ugly Nissan, and there's no doubt about it, they have nicer cars than me. But when it comes to their holidays, who knows? If I just go to the South Coast, it comes back to my point about the kind of Mauritius holiday or the Wales holiday. It's very hard to compare those things. There's the other aspect that there's something called positive reinterpretation that you get with experiences. When something goes wrong, let's go with the Welsh holiday here, for example, and it always rains. There's a Welsh person in my family, so this is, in fact, one of my grandmothers was Welsh, so this is okay for me to say. Let's say it rains the whole 2 weeks and you have that awful holiday. Or have you ever sat on a bus journey from, say, Delhi to Rishikesh, or to go across Peru, and the person sat next to you was sick all the time, and it was just horrible. It was hot, or it was cold, and it was wrong, and it was uncomfortable. Has everyone here been on that kind of journey or had that kind of thing? They're the best, aren't they? Because they're the worst at the time, but afterwards you get to tell that story. And also, experiences give you identity. If you had a choice between giving back that crystal sugar bowl you were given for your wedding present, or giving back the stag weekend you went on, or your friend's 50th birthday party, which would you give back? You'd give back the material good every time. So, no, I don't think we're going to stop competing. Yes, I think we'll carry on competing through experiences, and I think ultimately it's a good thing. I hope that answers your question.
It does, and I think It does answer the question, but I think if we want to move towards more happiness, then we have to move away from the competition, not from just moving the competition. So I don't think that we will get happier. I think we will just compete differently. And I think we can see that I agree with your prediction, but I think we can just see a movement in competition and not an increase in happiness.
There are a few things I like more than disagreeing with people. And I think it's great. I think we disagree. I don't think that human behaviour is going to change, and I think we will be still competing. There is a section in the book that goes through why experiences are better than material goods. So if we still keep competing, which I think we will do, but we do it through experiences, we are still going to have much better lives.
Okay, if we can
Thank
move
you.
to the next question. If we could ask this gentleman here.
Ian Tuckett. Enjoyed it a lot. It's this emphasis on experiences that still slightly bothers me. Because it sort of sounds, you said opera and plays and this, that and the other, and it still sounds like just constant stimuli, whereas part of me is thinking, well, actually, shouldn't we, if we want to be happy, look at the stars a bit more, enjoy nature, think, tweet less. But I suppose essentially it's about the experiences. It's the balance between being a consumer and being a creator. And that's what's out of sync. That for most of our human history, we've had to be creators and producers. But, you can turn culture into just the consumer experience.
I think that's a really interesting point. I'm not sure if you've got a question for me. I think it's a really interesting point, but if there's a...
It's really, I suppose, I probably do want to be in the Seychelles at this time of year, but the real thing about Wales is you do it if you're camping all yourself, whereas, the experience where you're given the champagne and have everything done for you, that's really, it's sort of, the questions really is, could you slightly think more about what experiences that people might give them the happiness that I think you're talking about?
I think it's a really, really good point. And in the book, what I've tried to do is, it's about evolution rather than revolution. And I think there are lots of people that stand up and say, I've got a manifesto, this is what we should do. And to an extent, that's in the book. I think we should shift from material to experiential, absolutely. But I think doing it in stages makes much more sense than saying, let's stop being consumers. Don't get me wrong, I think shopping as a pastime is an odd thing to do. And I think doing things by the very nature of the fact that we're using so many of our faculties is far more satisfying and happiness generating and gives us more meaning and identity, gives life more meaning. So this is not just shift from one way of consuming to another way of consuming. I think my example of walking in the park should hopefully do that. And there are lots more examples. I just picked some that I thought might resonate with the audience here.
Okay,
that's a really good point, thank you.
You've got the microphone, so I'll let you answer a question. And then...
The world is experiencing a stuffocation of people. Have you got an answer for that, short of holding up a black plastic bag over your head?
Do you want to repeat the question?
Oh yeah, the lady's just asked that maybe the world is having a stuffocation of people, and maybe the solution to that should be putting a bag over my head? But you're worried about population? Yeah. Oh, I'm not bothered about that at all, actually. No, it doesn't worry me. If you read Mega Change, for example, or you look at the statistics, the suggestion is that we'll hit 9 billion about 2050 or so, and then we'll tail off. Because as soon as people have more education, I say people as women have more education, they tend to have fewer children. So it's supposed to hit 9 billion and then tail off towards 2100. So no, I'm not bothered about that. We can feed everybody. I don't know what else to say about that than that. I think there's a lot of people in the world. I don't think it's a big problem. I don't want too many people because I quite like the idea of fields.
Okay, right. Well, we'll try and speed things up a bit. As the person at the back, and then if we can get the microphone over here for the next question. So if you mind, can we have both questions and then James can answer them both?
Shall I answer shorter?
question really is, are you not really talking about a two-stage process? Do you not have to go through consumerism to make the journey to experientialism? So if people are deprived today, it'll be very difficult for them to suddenly say, well, now we're just going to go for experience and not bother to go through the consumerist process.
Okay, so if we can part that, and I think there's a gentleman here.
Yeah, hello. My question's about advertising. I think you mentioned briefly you work for an advertising agency, and a lot of people would criticize advertising for provoking the materialism. Unless you're a holiday company, what is the future for advertising in the future, do you think?
Great question. Just to be clear, I don't work for an advertising company. I don't work for anyone. I had in the past, but I gave that up. I think your question's great about the two-stage process. And I don't know if I have a simple answer to it. Do you have to go through that stage? I think the answer, as I was saying to Tom before, the beauty of stuffication is that we have a good problem. Our problem is we have abundance, not scarcity. If you've never had an iPod or an iPhone, or you've never had 3 pairs of trainers, the idea of having 3 pairs of trainers is great. You know, a pair to run in, a pair to go to work in, a pair to, I don't know, go to the beach in and get wet. If you've never had those 3 pairs of shoes, that's great. But then once you get to the point of having so many of them, because the system, remember that idea, that paradox. Originally it was the American paradox. If we want to have more, we have to spend more. So I don't know, but I think if you've never had something, you want something. When you've got so much of it, you think, okay, it's time to move on, I want something else. And what's interesting about that, and I feel this possibly came out in that talk, is what my grandfather said. Because actually he knew that experiences mattered more than material goods. And maybe we come back to it in the end.
Is there a future for anyone other than travel agencies?
Absolutely. Sell experiences, not material goods. That's the short, long answer, because we will increasingly want experiences rather than material goods. There's a firm called Uber, which some of you may have come across in the States, and it's supposed to be the Amazon of stuff, but the Amazon of disownership. They want to kill ownership. So rather than owning things, they will give you access to the things that you need. So there are people in California who are giving up their cars because it's so cheap and easy to call this company and they'll come and pick you up as a taxi company. But what's really interesting is their real pitch is, let's say you want to have a barbecue at the weekend, but you live in a small home and you don't have a barbecue. You'll be able to phone these people up, they'll bring you a barbecue, you can have it for the day, and they'll pick it up the next day. And the trend from the trend towards what Buckminster Fuller called ephemeralization, getting more experience out of less material stuff, will only continue in the 21st century.
Which is the collaborative consumption.
Collaborative consumption is
it's-
part of that,
it's-
absolutely.
it's,
Zip car,
fascinating.
whip car, whatever.
Right, this gentleman just here, if we go to a microphone, and then the lady in the middle. So if we could take both questions, that'd be brilliant.
James, Roger Evans. James, I would have thought one of the best examples of people who have got into experiencing things are our kids who experience playing for their favourite football team on their Xbox, or shooting people in an American city online all day. And the question I've got is, do you actually have to physically be there to get happiness from an experience? And the reason I asked that is 2 years ago, I asked my son if he'd like to go canoeing down the Zambezi River, which I thought would be a very exciting experience. And he said, no, I'll have a look at it on YouTube instead. And surely our children are early adopters of this change.
And if we could just have the second question, and then we'll take both of those.
Yes, Sue Gilly. I understand that you're not proposing the end of capitalism and the end of all consumerism, but surely a long-term effect of what you're suggesting is going to mean less stuff made, which means less employment. Do you see a change in employment practices?
Okay, if you could take those two, James.
Two fantastic questions, thank you. When you said your name was Evans, I thought you were going to take me to task on the whole raining in Wales, so I was very glad about that. Just to be clear, I will come with you to the Zambezi River, very happily. I don't know if I know the answer to that. I'm concerned for your children, that they don't want to do that. But can you get experiences digitally as well? Yes, why not? And actually, I think it's quite interesting and shows my age that I'm judging, to an extent, your child on that. But if that's what makes you happy and that's where you get your experiences, it's great. Why not?
So you can do it online.
Well, why should we judge the place or where somebody gets their pleasure? If somebody, one person would prefer to go and watch football tonight, and one person would rather go and see a play, one person would rather watch television. I don't want to judge any of them. If that's what they want to do, that's fine. So, sorry if that's not a more definitive answer. And thank you for your question. I think it's a really interesting point. There's a number of things. Whenever there is any kind of change, some win, some lose. If you look at the Luddites as the great example, there were a lot of people that were really concerned that those machines were going to take their jobs away. And rightly so, because they did. That's what happens. So through any kind of revolution or change, there will be some companies that go by the wayside. Just think in the last 10 years, do you remember HMV, Tower Records? All those high street names that we thought would be around forever, didn't we? Do you remember Tower Records? And it was compelling, wasn't it? It was a great store. That's gone. Where are those jobs gone? What's happening with the high street in this country? The statistics for the number of stores that are supposed to be closing between now and I think it's about 2015, 2016 are pretty horrific. But has that changed any of you from buying online? No, because it's easy, right? So when something happens, there will be change. But that's not to say there aren't jobs in the experience economy. Let's go to computer games. Huge business, worth more than the Hollywood business. But also if you think about secret cinema as a good example. Have you come across secret cinema? Okay, so secret cinema is a great example of the experience economy. And they put on a movie, I'm trying to think what it was now. They put on a movie in Croydon, and over the period of about a month, they employed 40-odd people, and they made, and now I can't remember the numbers, but they made more money than was made at the IMAX for the same movie. And the thing was, it wasn't just the people on the door letting people in, it was the actors who were taking part. There are lots of jobs in the experience economy, so it's not like there won't be any jobs anymore.
Right, let's see if we can just squeeze in a couple of final questions.
We can
Gentleman
talk
there,
about it
I think
afterwards.
if you wear a Father Christmas hat, you get to ask a question. And if we just have this lady here, and if you can make your questions quite to the point and brief, then we'll hopefully get through them before the time runs out. Okay.
Hi, Charlie Jackson. So with experientialism, does this increase the importance of our memories? And more importantly, have you seen or do you expect to see some changes in the way we display and relive, say, photos and memories in terms of the products and things like that?
Okay, and this question here, please.
Yeah, my name is Christine, and I have one question for you. I like the whole idea, and I can see it happen, but everybody always says, I don't have time, I don't have time. And experiences will cost a hell of a lot of time. How do you see this, the issue of time in the picture?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. I'm going to take the easy question first. Thank you. If you define yourself by any kind of experience, you need a memory of it to remember it. You know those awful nights that you go out and you drink too much and you can't remember? None of you remember that, right? Okay. Yeah. So you need to remember it, absolutely. And will we remember it differently? Yes. Think about Google Glass. And there are other examples of that where we will literally record things that we do. We will have devices on us that will do a video of what you saw. So it doesn't matter how drunk you got, you will know what you did. So yes, experiences will mean memories are important, and there will be more digital ways to do that, absolutely. Time's a really fascinating question because I've been given experiential products in the past that I've really struggled to get round to doing. And I think really we need to turn to the behavioural economists there and look at, Cass Sunstein's written about this in some great detail online about how you should be careful what you buy people for Christmas because it might just be a waste. I don't know if I have the answer, to be honest with you. I think copping out by buying someone a material gift is just giving them something that takes their time because they have to think about where they're going to store it. They have to think about where the store is they're going to take it back to, or the person they're going to offload that present onto. Or they're going to, you know that awful thing you do in January, you queue up to take back that thing someone's given you. So when you get that gift, what they're giving you is a sentence. They're actually cutting half an hour out of your life and the hassle of going to the store. So I encourage you not to give those awful gifts yourself out of a sense of guilt of handing something over. But in terms of time, I guess living takes time, doesn't it? If you want good experiences, you have to put some effort in.
And rather fittingly, talking of time, we unfortunately at the end of our time. Well, finally from me, thank you all so much for coming to the lecture here at the RSA. I hope it's been a stimulating conversation. One of the lovely things about hearing from James is his book is going to be outside, so you can purchase copies, and he will be there to sign copies, and you can probably get him with a few more questions. I hope it's made you think differently. Reading the book for me certainly made me think about some things differently. But finally, can you please thank our speaker, James Wolman?